All right, so that was a hard act to follow. I'm a good thing that I totally changed my slides. So one interesting thing is that I think what Mika was saying was basically the Tony Stark. I would say I was just about to go on the metaphor Spider-Man before I changed it, where people don't actually know who the hero is. Okay, so I've been in this space for a very long time. So back when I started, about 15 or 16 years ago, it wasn't called Civic Tech. It was called ICT for Development. So you had projects, like the OLPC and things like Digital Divide and so on. So during my time, when we were talking about Civic Tech, it was basically setting up towers in Nepal for the first internet ever to get to Nepal. It was about just having computers in the hands of people, and it was a very, very limited elite. So when yesterday Greg was talking about literacy, this was basically, maybe the Egyptian time in terms of literacy and being able to read and write. Very few people had access to the internet and computers at that time. And the reason I bring up the OLPC is to differentiate between projects that will naturally die out because of continuing advances in technology versus institutions. So I'm just going to go through a little bit of history. Okay, so one thing that, just like Facebook during my time, the ability to use open source, to share, to hack wasn't a given freedom. We had to fight for that. The ability to have access source code during my time, we had to go around and advocate people that open source is a good thing. And I was doing this in my development world because we were saying that, why should we spend billions on software if we could reshare it when that development money should be going towards, clean water and so on. So we had to fight for that. And just as we had, it was grassroots going out, trying to tell people, look, collaborating, the right to have access to software, the right to be able to code, the right to share was a concept that we were fighting 15 years ago. Things that we kind of take for granted right now. Oops, go back a bit. So here's an example of the work I did. So at that time, I would say the elephant in the room was Microsoft. And at that time, if you were using a computer, you'd have to use Windows. So one of the work that we did was, if you were not part of this larger group, like in Cambodia, for example, and you were not a big enough market, you would not be able to write emails in your own language because you didn't have the software, you didn't have the capability. And if, in this case, proprietary software or large companies felt that your community was not needed, too bad. You would be excluded for this. So working in development, that was not an option. In my case, everybody had to have access. We were building digital governments. We were trying to get people on board the internet in terms of developing technology. And if you were too small a market, and you were not allowed to have access to the software or the knowledge to do such things, you would be excluded. So in Cambodia, we actually had to support developing the fonts. And we also had to support open source because they were able to create their own fonts. They were able to customize their own operating system. I think they customized OpenCZ. They translated Mozilla Thunderbird at that time to be able to write and use the internet in their own language. And believe me, this was not a simple thing about localization. It was a battle. And I think that was good that we have the Facebook analogy now. And I was working for UNDP, so that's the scope of the battle. You were fighting at a global scale, governments versus big tech. They didn't want to do that. They would try to influence policy to avoid having open source. They tried to push software patents in. They tried to change standards of what free and sharing was. They tried to restrict government policy in procurement. They tried to limit standards to control this space, such that you would be locked in, and in terms of the software ecosystem that you're doing through. So we were fighting this for a long time. So it's not a new battle. And yeah, so just an example of the lock-in. back in 1990, no, back in the early 2000s, a huge battle was just over standards on documents, HTML. You could not use certain government websites if you did not use the right browser, or in this case, Internet Explorer. And there was a huge battle even about, so now we're talking about open data. Back then, we were talking about documents. Must you buy software just to open up a document? So it was a big fight over PDF and ODF versus proprietary software. Again, Civic tech at my time. So the Indian Ocean tsunami, 2004. I'm not sure if this is a northern thing. So there was a lot of heroes in there, but you would never know who they were. So back in 2004 tsunami, Civic tech at that time was basically set up a mailing list for coordination. That was at the limit. So just to be able to communicate in different countries and different agencies in real time, which was basically mailing lists at that time, was basically Civic tech. Now it's a lot improved. We learned a lot from there, but people were basically sending emails and packets. IFRC, which is the Red Cross arm for disaster, it was just through emails. And now we've got a lot better at it. So we were talking about disaster, so it's nothing new. It's a continuous thing. Same thing right now. We have things like the TPP. Back then, it was FTA, WTO. Restrictions in the way that we are able to access knowledge, access information, work with code. We had to fight that in trade agreements as well. The current round, I think EFF was highlighting as well, was something about access to source code. So for example, if you were, like for example, Volkswagen, they had their emission software. They're putting into trade agreements now where you cannot have access to that. So this is another level of fighting for basic civic, access to knowledge, access to tech. And it's not a new fight, and it keeps on going. And the reason I'm doing for this history is because it's an ongoing thing. You'll be fighting for these things. Now we've got Facebook. We'll be fighting these things 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and it will take different forms. Okay, so yeah. So the different evolving threats to these rights, rights to access to information, rights to produce technology, rights to share the technology, changes across times. Microsoft Word documents at that time, ODF, then HTML, the browser wars, software patents, which is still an ongoing fight, trademarks, and this is an ongoing thing because of big space, so it's not, and it goes across, and it evolves, and you have to keep fighting it. So one thing that people often hear, people say CNR Project is a civic tech organization. Actually, we're a rights organization, and I'll tell you, and that's why we've, in terms of sustainability, why we're a bit longer, or last longer than just civic tech, because projects go and come and go. So when I think about, if you're talking about in terms of organization or institutions, I would say in terms of sustainability, you should have an identity of what exactly rights are you fighting for. So for example, at CNR Project, we have pretty clear goals. In our case, we follow the Open Parliament Declaration, and we have a couple of key goals here: promoting culture of openness, making government information transparent, electronic communication, access to elected representatives, and at the bottom of that, as a core value, we use human rights because we need those human rights for freedom of expression, association, to do these things. So this is what we go for, not tech and not projects, because this is going to evolve. So maybe we're doing websites now and mobile apps. Who knows what we're going to do 5 years, but our core, what we're fighting for, stays the same. So let's look at the organizations that last longest. So things like electronic EFF, 1990. So that's a long fight, 1990. So it's like what now, 18, 30, was it? Yeah, 38 years or so. Then I was to say people were saying dinosaur in my society, especially 2003. But if you look at what my society is doing, which is access to representatives and so on, if you look at the House of Lords, it was established in 1215. So you're talking, what was the incarnation of my society before this, before tech, and before that, going centuries, right? So there's always some incarnation of fighting for rights to representatives, representation, democracy, and so on. And I often do this in Malaysia because we have issues on race. And people think it's an easy, quick fix. If you look at the NAACP, which is what the National Association for Advancement of Colored, right? People, they've been fighting against racism for 108 years. That's over a century. Has it been solved in the US? I would say probably not, right? So we have to think, so when you come to thinking about rights, it's a forever process. Projects come and go, but these goals continue on. So I would say that if you're thinking about sustainability, you would build communities around these goals and institutions, these rights, rather than across projects. So there's probably a community around the one PC, the OLPC, but that community is probably gone now. But I can tell you for sure that the community fighting for open source and software patents, people like EFF are still here because they're fighting for some greater rights. The trade organizations still fighting for different rights in terms of, trade agreements are still around. So when you're talking about sustainable communities, I would say build it around the goals and the institutions. And sometimes the institutions might change, but the goals remain the same. So find what is that core goal or right that you're defending. So so here's an example of us 6 years ago. Many of these people are now actually in government. They were students at that time. So it wasn't about CNR project, it was about the goals at that time, access to representatives and so on. And now some of these people are actually in government, still within our community working on those same goals. So, so that goes through kind of history and sustainability of organizations, but then you come back, and I wanted to make it a little bit more personal or individual, like the burnout question, right? So I come from a place that's pretty bad until we switched governments. We had all these laws on just basic freedom of information. We had the Sedation Act, which we blame the UK for because it's a colonial era law. Which basically means if you make anybody upset against the government, you could get jailed and arrested. We had the Printing and Presses Act, which means any form or method to convey information needs a license. And we often joke smoke signals would come into this. It was restricted. We had University Act, where students were not allowed to be in politics. If you did, you could get suspended or get removed, and a whole slew of different things. So it was a pretty constrained and depressing place to work in. So if you are working in a constrained place, I would say align yourself with an ecosystem of other rights organizations. So in this case, who are the other people in your space? I actually did a map of the US because it was good. So if you're in the US, you would look at NAACP, you would look at the ACLU, you would look at the EFF, you would look at a couple of different people working around different rights. And where does, in this case, where for rights in terms of digital, you'd see the EFFs of the world, often working with the ACLUs. In Malaysia, CNR project would be kind of the EFF / My Society. And we would fit in with people working on strategic litigation, constitutional rights, human rights, and so on. And this helps in terms of facing adversity. So if you're fighting for the same underlying rights, like say freedom of association, you're not alone in this. So one of the things that kept me going in there was knowing that if anything happened to me, this ecosystem of rights would be able to support me. As in, I knew that the legal association would help me out. And that would be a Virgil outside of the police station if I was ever arrested. And that helps you with the community. So yeah, this is one of our friends. So when she got arrested, Twitter, She was not in the civic tech community, but we were part of that goal, and in terms of helping each other out. Next, and I was at a conference just a week ago, and I was surprised at how common the problems were in terms of dealing with burnout. Whether you're a reporter doing conflict or trauma, or even a little bit less in terms of, your code keeps failing to build at different levels of frustration. One of the things I've learned was the separation between work and personal. Be very careful of this. Even though it's, sometimes it's a personal cause, to make sure your work and sometimes your personal life. So what we were saying, for example, is that I don't talk about my work with my wife. I separate it out. I have my normal friends, and then I have my civic tech friends. So, my wife doesn't want to hear about all the problems about civic tech, right? It's good to have that separation where you can kind of separate yourself out. Don't mix the two together. Second part is, of course, you still need to talk to people about your problems and so on. And you would have this extended family of people working closely in the same area, and I've actually got to finish up shortly. So in this case, it'll be your clique, your group. For journalists, it's the people that work the same beat as you. For civic tech, it might be people working around the same project as you, or even in your little local communities, people that you can talk to and vent and so on, but who also provide support in other ways. So it's like a family, but it's not your personal family. Again, avoid negativity, remove Facebook. My Twitter is extremely curated. Anybody who posts something negative, I take them out, or I mute them, because, who wants more negativity? So I had a reporter who said she only read stories with happy endings, right? So there's enough negativity in our work, so remove that. And just about to wrap it up, one thing that to keep avoiding burnout is that realize that all of us in the civic tech space are working from an extremely high vantage of privilege. We are the elite. We have internet. Most of us here speak English. We have savings. We have credit cards and so on. So as bad as it gets, we are still working in an area of privilege, and we should always think about, how can we use this privilege more? So whenever you ever feel depressed, know that you have a pretty nice internet. You have fast internet. You're working in a white-collar job. There's people far worse than you, and you're always in an area of privilege. So I think it's that. And finally, I would say, stay the course. As I mentioned in the organizations before, it's a it's an ongoing thing when you're thinking about in terms of democracy and freedom of expression. It never ends. So in this case, I would say don't think about it as, multiple times. It's not a sprint. It's a marathon, and it's a never-ending marathon. So stay the course and chill. Like, don't know that it's never going to end. Yeah. Thank you.
Is this on? Okay, it's too loud a bit. Let's see some questions from the audience. Thank you for the things that you've said. I don't know, what personal life? Is there a separation? I don't know. I mean, or what happens when your wife is also working in the same field? How do you... Anyway, I have some questions of my own. Okay, so what are the biggest challenges you have in civic tech in Malaysia? It's quite a broad question, but it connects to the next one. Do you collaborate with NGOs from the neighboring countries? So I could ask.
Okay. So I would say one of the biggest challenges is, like I said, we're not working in a bubble. So the challenge in Malaysia for civic tech is that we're a civil society organization. So we've come from a country with over 57 years where civil society is constrained. So the problems in Malaysia for civic tech is a civil society problem. So how do you have a vibrant civil society? It's a bigger challenge than actually the tech itself. So we got to build our institutions. We got to teach people basic things about why you need civil society. It seems kind of obvious in some countries, but that concept is not immediately available. or not common. So I think that would be the biggest challenge in civic tech in Malaysia, is to for our population to understand the role of civil society and the importance of the civil society, and not just the big companies and government. And yes, we collaborate with NGOs from neighboring countries because at least in Southeast Asia, we face similar problems. While the constraints have been lifted in Malaysia, in Myanmar, in Cambodia, which has gotten even worse, they face those same constraints as well. So we work with them because we understand each other really well. So it's actually a close-knit community in Southeast Asia.
Okay, so we have a lot of questions coming in. Alex is asking us, what's the single most effective way to unite people and set up support nets? I was also wondering this, what do you say in the heat of the moment to get everyone aligned again? So how do you do these support nets? Because I know it takes time to build this kind of intersectional groups.
I think it ebbs and flows. Right? I think the US were often saying, I think we're at the journalist conference, was that journalism was kind of going down until Trump got elected, so it goes up. In a lot of countries, it goes up. Sometimes you have elections, sometimes you have disasters, sometimes you have economic recession and other kind of things. So usually for me, the alignment and support ebbs and goes, and it usually goes strongest when there's a challenge, that a common cause. So in Malaysia, for example, the last election, everybody rallied around. Suddenly we had like 200 people more in our community. But then once the election was over, it goes down again. So I would say it's you synchronize around some kind of events where people find something in common. Yeah.
So there needs to be a sense of urgency at least, or. Okay, some questions about the CNR project. What is the CNR project's base? Who joins and supports? Can you tell people a bit more about?
Okay. Interestingly, our community is LGBT tech and women, or women who code. Mostly because we're more like because in a constrained society, we had to fight for rights. So our base is actually people who believe that they need to defend some specific right. So for example, the LGBT community in terms of persecution, women, issues around gender discrimination and so on. So interestingly enough, that's our base. So we don't actually have much of the main tech or developer base. Our base is more the subset of it. Women who code, LGBT developers, and misfits who can't stand corporations. And so that's our base. Yeah.
What about in terms of size?
I would say that our core group, I think my colleague shared this in Taiwan, the core group is probably about 6 to 10 people. Nice. And with about, I think now, because after the government change, we probably have about 50 people in kind of the community around us. Yeah.
So there is a peak when there are election times, you can see more people being interested. Let's take this one. What if you succeed? Should you close your organization down or look for another cause?
Just as in my talk, there's no success. Is racism solved in the US after 100 years? Probably no. It's the same thing with democracy. It's never going to be a continuing problem. We just changed to a more democratic country. Is the government better? No. We still don't have our FOI laws. Politicians still do what politicians do. So yeah, I don't think there's actually any success because, as I was mentioning, the organization is doing for a cause and defending rights and not a project. If CNR project, that's ironic, was actually a project on some, to build something, then probably it would end over. But because it's a rights-based organization, you'll forever be defending human rights.
So there's a thought coming in from Mika, maybe changes the sprint or a marathon, but it's a relay race, so we pass the torch from one to another.
Yeah, I think so too. And yeah, I actually often say this. Actually, it's a good point. So that's why I said it's about community building. So we're always looking for the next generation. So in my case, I'm actually not very active anymore in the day-to-day workshops. I rarely come because now it's the next generation to take it up. But what I've noticed is that, yeah, it's more a relay. So it's actually probably about 10 core people maybe that keep changing. But the wider community was actually a bit of a challenge. But yeah, we keep having 5 new people every 5 years or so.
But you're a veteran. You're there for quite some time.
Yep.
How do you manage? Well, that's my question. Let's go to the questions from the audience. So, what methods have you found most effective to break down the silos between disparate communities, the civic tech, development work, and rights-based organizations? So how do you make them come together somehow?
I'm just trying to think. Where there's actually not much of a silo, because what we found is that there's common causes. Like I said, if you notice in the US, EFF working with ACLU on the digital intersection. And it's the same in Malaysia. We have intersections with corruption. So then there's no silo. We work as a separate, we would work on the digital parts of it, and the traditional NGOs would work on the non-tech part. But we actually work together because it's the same cause. And one thing maybe a way to see about breaking the silos is actually see common frameworks. So we actually use, like, for example, the UN Declaration for Human Rights. That's a common framework. Mm-hmm. We would also use, for example, the Parliamentary Declaration for Openness. There's a couple of common goals there. And we find out that most other civil society organizations have common goals, and then it's not so much of a silo. The harder challenge for that is actually for them to understand the digital part. Why is it important?
Yeah, indeed. Have you seen the Malaysian institutions develop or progress in your time doing this work? Can you share some examples in this area?
Okay, maybe I need clarification on that. Institutions as in Civic Tech or just institutions in general? If it's institutions in general, no. And this is something that we learned as a Civic Tech org. Originally, we thought we were a bit naive, and we thought that we were smarter and a little bit arrogant or hubris than the other NGOs because we, tech and all these tools. But what I did learn was that the other institutions were also limited because of systematic constraints. And this is something to be aware of. What are the systematic constraints in your country? So in Malaysia, there were some specific laws on nonprofits. There was the government, the previous government, for example, would raid or put pressure anytime some organization got a little bit too big. So in this sense, just like before I was saying, you are a civil society organization, even though you work in tech. So you would have common constraints with the rest of your fellow institutions or organizations.
Speaking about battles, what are your main battles at the moment?
Interestingly, the battle right now is because of our new government. People feel that they don't need to fight anymore and that the government is good. But unfortunately,
But you disagree.
Unfortunately, the system doesn't change. We still don't have an FOI law. The new government says they're good, but they still haven't disclosed any information, it's just like the previous government. So I would say the current battle right now is, again, going back to the rights thing. Okay, we've got 0 minutes now, so that's maybe the last question. I would say that to keep people, to make sure, the battle is to make people understand that these problems are huge, take a long time to do, and even though sometimes you get certain quick wins, it's an ongoing process, and that you don't step back when things get a little bit better because it's an ongoing battle. It's not. I would say this battle continues. Yeah.
The struggle continues. Do we still have time for one more question? Do you think so? Yeah, just one. Would you like to choose the one? I mean, there's the one already asked, what happens when your wife is also working in the same field, but I don't know if you can share some thoughts on this one. So, no, let's take this one. Do you ever consider whether your funding could be better used elsewhere?
Wow.
Yeah, I know.
How do you? Actually, we do, and this always comes back to privilege. So one funding proposal that I'm working on right now was, should that money go to a higher income country like Malaysia, or would it be better off in Myanmar where it could support a team for a year? I would say that dynamic is always playing in my mind right now, as in when you have this funding, especially if you're a higher income country, do you take international donor money, or do you try to build the challenges of trying to fix local funding in your middle income country or higher middle income country versus taking it from less developed countries that might need it more. Yep.
So I think that wraps it up. Thank you.